that bubble, and if that bubble crashes, it's a problem. The word bubble, remember the word bubble, you heard it here first. I mean, I don't want to sound rude, but I hope if it explodes, it's going to be now rather than 2 months into another administration. We have the worst revival of an economy since the Great Depression. And believe me, we're in a bubble right now. And the only thing that looks good is the stock market. But if you raise interest rates even a little bit, that's going to come crashing down. We are in a big, fat, ugly bubble. And we have a Fed that's doing political things. This Janet Yellen of the Fed is doing political by keeping the interest rates at this level. When they raise interest rates, you're going to see some very bad things happen because the Fed is not doing their job. The Fed is being more political than Secretary Clinton.
There is a huge, historic economic bubble. The financial collapse is prophesied in the Bible with the third seal, the rider on the black horse. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing we can do about it. The Bible says they will cast their gold in the streets because it will be absolutely worthless coming up. This is a very interesting documentary I want you to see and study with me just for awareness, but let's be ready. Let's be ready to give this whole world up for Jesus.
Love him or hate him, there's one thing nobody can deny. Donald Trump knows a lot about the U.S. economy. He's part of the 1% running this country and has built a multi-billion-dollar fortune. So, is the Republican frontrunner full of hot air again? Or is this a slip of the tongue from somebody who knows more than he's willing to share with the rest of us? The answer to this question will shock even hardcore liberals. In my research, I have uncovered a strange pattern that has been going on for the past 20 years. A bizarre economic cycle intimately linked to every U.S. election since then. Right now, I will show you the hard facts that led me to this conclusion in plain and simple English, so that by the end of this video, you can make your own choice and be better prepared for what's to come. But to understand how this bizarre pattern works, we need to take a short look back at 1999.
When the ball drops on the year 2000, it will be a momentous event for the world and for the U.S. economy, which is closing in on its longest expansion ever. The decade has been marked by strong growth, the lowest unemployment in a generation, and yet remarkably little inflation.
It seemed like a totally different America than the one we are living in today. The stock market was booming thanks to the internet companies, affectionately called the dot-coms. For many Americans, investing in the internet companies seemed like the quickest way to become rich. More and more people put their savings into the stock market, driving it higher and higher. They gambled their money on the hope that they could sell those stocks for 2 to 3 times their value. And everybody was praising the Clinton administration for creating the biggest economic growth in U.S. history. For a time, it worked. To many, it seemed like the party would never end. Even the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, said, "Technology is creating a new economy, one where the old rules no longer applied." The Fed was so confident that in February 2000, it began raising the interest rates to their highest level since 1995. At the same time, bad economic data started to come in. The previous holiday season that was supposed to bring big profits to internet-based companies was a major disappointment. And it was not just online shopping. Ordinary Americans bought less and consumption was dropping. While the nation was preparing for the next election, the house of cards built around the stock market started to collapse. On the 12th of April, 2000, the NASDAQ dropped by 386 points. It was the largest drop ever recorded, and by the end of the next week, Wall Street had lost almost a quarter of its value. The long economic boom of the late 90s became a gigantic bust. Bush was entering office at a time when the NASDAQ had lost 60% of its value, erasing $7 trillion of American wealth. Clinton's economy grew on the back of the dot-com bubble, and now everybody was looking to Bush to get the economy going again. But before going any further, let's take a short step back and see what we can learn from this. An economic bubble grows around an asset that becomes very attractive to investors. In the 90s, this asset was the internet company stock. Greed attracts more and more people who gamble their money, hoping that prices will go up and they will sell for a profit later. When people are blinded by the bubble, they think that growth will never end. This delusion is fueled by the media, economic experts, and even the Fed. At this point, something very interesting happened. As the economy showed signs of slowing down, the Fed raised the interest rate. And curiously, some months before the next U.S. election, the bubble bursts, creating massive economic pain. We now have a theory that we can put to the test. A bubble emerges and grows on low interest rates. Investors and speculators are down in, as the experts say. Everything is fine and growth will continue. The Fed raises interest rates in a time where the economy begins to slow down. And that specific time is right before the next presidential election. The bubble bursts, and the next president has to deal with the aftermath. If this sounds crazy to you right now, let's put the theory to the test.
I do believe in the American dream. I believe there is such a thing as the American dream. Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream.
The asset this time was houses. The Federal Reserve had cut interest rates from 6% in 2001 to 1% in 2003. Rock-bottom interest rates created a huge demand for mortgages, as they were cheaper to pay off. Everybody wanted a house, and that pushed prices up. You could get rich just by becoming a homeowner, as the price kept going up. Soon, even people who could not afford to make a down payment or could not provide proof of a steady income and collateral were given loans to purchase new homes. If these people defaulted on their payments, the bankers didn't care. They would be left with a house, an asset that was rising in price. These no down payment, no collateral mortgage loans, called subprime mortgages, were given to millions of low-income families.
And one of the barriers to home ownership is the inability to make a down payment. And if one of the goals is to increase home ownership, it makes sense to help people pay that down payment.
Now, the bankers had a brilliant idea. Bundle up the normal mortgages with the subprime ones and sell them to other banks, pension funds, hedge funds, and sovereign funds. Mortgage payments generated huge profits, and demand was high for this new type of speculative contract, now called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs. This created the housing bubble.
Ben, there's been a lot of talk about a housing bubble, particularly, from the Fed, from all sorts of different places. Can you give us your view as to whether or not there is a housing bubble out there?
Well, unquestionably, housing prices are up quite a bit. I think it's important to note that fundamentals are also very strong. We've got a growing economy, jobs, incomes. We've got very low mortgage rates.
The experts appeared all over mainstream news, assuring everyone that housing was not a bubble.
Wealth has risen dramatically. The United States economy has never been better shape. There is no tax increase coming in the next couple of years. Monetary policy is spectacular.
The Federal Reserve now started to increase interest rates. By 2007, the interest rates had reached 5.25%, and many families with subprime mortgages could not afford to make the monthly payments, and their homes were foreclosed. As more and more houses went up for sale, the prices started dropping. Consumption plummeted. A new crisis had begun, and it would reach its peak in fall 2008, right before the elections. House prices tanked. Banks and other investment funds found that their bulletproof, high-profit CDOs became worthless. No one wanted to buy CDOs or houses anymore. It was a financial bloodbath. The banking giant, Lehman Brothers, had bet on mortgages and was left holding assets nobody wanted anymore. On the 15th of September, it filed for bankruptcy. During November 2008, Americans lost more than a quarter of their collective net worth. U.S. stocks were down by 45% from its 2007 high. Housing prices had dropped 20% from their 2006 peak. Total U.S. household wealth went down by $14 trillion. Through the banking giant Citicorp, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan, and Goldman Sachs, the big traders of CDOs, the crisis had spread to the world. And now, stocks and property values plummeted everywhere. The economy of the world entered a deep recession. All this happened as our nation was preparing to choose its 44th president. The housing bubble burst 2 months before the election. So how does our theory stand? We had a new housing and subprime mortgage bubble created by low interest rates. Many Americans thought housing was a secure investment. The banks gambled huge sums of money on CDOs. The experts, again, said everything was fine. The economy started to weaken in late 2007 as the Fed was increasing the interest rates. The bubble violently burst just as Americans were preparing to vote for the 44th President of the United States. Everything that happened in 2000 happened again in 2008. The bubble burst in the year of the elections. Only this time, it was bigger, and the damage was global and massive. The theory is proven correct again. There's an election coming this November. Will there be another economic crisis? Let's go through our checklist again. In December 2015, the Fed started to increase interest rates. For the past 5 years, the rate has been close to 0%. The economy is already showing signs of slowing down. Right now, the Bloomberg Commodity Index hit a 16-year low. The last time this happened was August 2008. Commodities represent all the goods being traded around the world. Everything from oil to coffee, sugar, steel, and copper. When their price slumps, it signals a slowdown in the world economy. Oil is reaching its 2008 low point. The last time the price of oil was this low, the global financial system was melting down. And this time, it will hit the U.S. economy much harder because of the shale miracle. CNBC's Jim Cramer is warning that many U.S. oil companies will become bankrupt if the price of oil remains this low. The price of copper, too, has plunged all the way down to $2. The last time it was this low was just before the stock market crash of 2008. Consumption is slowing down. U.S. imports of goods declined by 6.6% on a year-over-year basis. U.S. exports of goods declined by 10.4% on a year-over-year basis. 2015 was the worst year for holiday spending since 2008. U.S. manufacturing is contracting at the fastest pace that we have seen since the last recession. If just one or two of these indicators were flashing red, that would be bad enough. The fact that all of them seem to be saying the exact same thing tells us that big trouble is ahead. So, what are the experts saying?
What do you see right now? Actually, the economy is fundamentally strong. Housing is booming, technology is booming, commercial real estate's booming.
In all fairness to Obama, during his administration in the last few years, jobs have been created and the jobless rate is way down.
If you just kept it simple, you'd say that the United States is growing almost at kind of a trend growth, whether it's 2.5 or just under 3% growth or maybe even a little above it. Well, no, but around trend growth.
Following our checklist, we have an election year, the Fed raising interest rates, an economy slowing down, experts saying everything is fine. The only thing that's missing is the bubble that Trump warned will burst before the November elections. Does he know something we don't?
The word bubble, remember the word bubble, you heard it here first. I mean, I don't want to sound rude, but I hope if it explodes, it's going to be now rather than 2 months into another administration.
Well, to understand exactly what a bubble is, we need to look back at the dot-com and the mortgage CDO bubbles. In both cases, people thought that they had something that would never stop growing, something too big to fail. In both cases, stocks and housing attracted huge sums of money, driving their prices way beyond the actual value. This is just like gambling. Buyers get the asset, hoping they will sell it in the future for a profit. When the bubble bursts, those who are left with the asset suffer huge losses. Right now, I must ask you to give me your full attention. The following 5 minutes will be shocking and a little bit tricky to understand. And I hope you're sitting down for this. My prediction for 2016 is that we will see a banking collapse that will make the 2008 crisis look like a Sunday afternoon picnic. This coming crash will wipe out the entire U.S. financial sector and take with it savings, deposits, retirement funds, pensions. It'll be nothing short of a financial bloodbath. How can this be possible? Well, remember how bubbles are created when something seems to grow indefinitely? The delusion is that something is too big to fail. But the bigger the bubble becomes, the faster it fails. Right now, people think big banks can't fail because of their size and importance in the world economy. It is as blatant as their name suggests. How did we get here? On September 18, 2008, Hank Paulson, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, told members of Congress that $5.5 trillion in wealth would disappear by 2 p.m. that day unless the government took immediate action. What took place next was undoubtedly the biggest blackmail in history. The threat: keep the big banks alive, or else the economy implodes and depositors lose their money. In December 2008, the first of many financial stability measures was put into place. The Fed's mission from now on was to keep the big banks alive no matter what. Economists calculated that the total cost of the various measures put into place to accommodate big banks was in excess of $20 trillion up to this year. The too big to fail banks now had a taxpayer-sponsored safety net. The message was clear: do whatever risky business you want. We've got your back. And this is how Congress and the Federal Reserve created the ultimate bubble, the too big to fail bubble. The idea that the too big to fails were going to get cut down to size after the financial crisis has turned into a giant myth. In fact, they've become even bigger. J.P. Morgan Chase, number one among banks in total assets, has seen its base swell to more than $2.5 trillion. The company's deposit base alone has grown by 29% since the end of 2008. The so-called Big Four institutions, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, continue to distance themselves from the pack, with some $8.2 trillion in total assets. That's 154% more than the rest of the top 50 banks combined. Unfortunately, the old saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, will prove correct. And when they collapse, the result will be nothing short of catastrophic for the world economy. But for a bubble to inflate, you also need an asset on which speculation, or rather gambling, has become so rampant and so over the top that a disaster is just waiting to happen. Let me introduce you to the world's biggest and most dangerous casino. It's called the derivatives market. And right now, the total net worth of all outstanding derivatives contracts is a staggering $552.9 trillion, according to the Bank for International Settlements. $552.9 trillion. Let that number sink in for a moment. Total U.S. debt right now stands close to $19 trillion, and most Americans find that shocking. But very few have any idea of how big this financial market is. The entire economy of the world, in real goods and services, is evaluated at around $78 trillion annually. The derivative market is 7 times the value of every good and every service provided around the world in an entire year. At first, I thought this number was too big to be real. But the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, independent bureau of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, confirms it. Make no mistake, you are looking at the biggest bubble in the history of mankind. Something 7 times greater than the entire economy of the world. So what exactly is a derivative? A derivative is a speculative contract, a bet placed on stocks, mortgages, interest rates, the price of commodities like gold, silver, coffee, oil, or the possibility of a company or even a nation to default. Basically, right now, there is nothing of economic worth that does not have some sort of derivative attached to it. All derivatives are bets. This is not a metaphor, an analogy, or a generalization. The players on the derivative market gamble trillions on the future price of the asset to which the derivative is attached. These are the speculative contracts that will eventually pop the current gigantic bubble. Warren Buffett once referred to derivatives as financial weapons of mass destruction, and he was proven right. The CDOs that led to the crash of 2008 were derivatives, as they drew their value from interest payments on mortgages and housing prices. They were traded on this market just like all the other derivatives, and they were just a tiny part of the market. In 2008, there were about $500 billion worth of CDOs. That was only a very tiny fraction of the derivatives market, yet it was enough to almost collapse the economy of the world. Remember how I said that this is the world's largest casino? In a nutshell, the derivatives market, or more correctly put, the derivatives casino, is where big banks and other financial institutions place their bets on every aspect of the world economy. Yet with these bets, everybody loses. So how did this bubble inflate to more than $550 trillion? Sajak controls the derivative department of one of the too-big-to-fail banks. He knows that the riskier the bet, the higher the profit he gets, and the bigger his bonus. And he thinks, just like everyone else, that if he loses, the Federal Reserve will bail him out just like in 2008. What do you think Jack would do? How much do you think Jack would bet on derivatives? Well, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency has the exact numbers. Citigroup, total assets more than $1.8 trillion. Total exposure to derivatives, more than $53 trillion. JP Morgan Chase, total assets about $2.4 trillion. Total exposure to derivatives, more than $51 trillion. Goldman Sachs, total assets less than $1 trillion. Total exposure to derivatives, more than $51 trillion. Bank of America, total assets a little bit more than $2.1 trillion. Total exposure to derivatives, more than $45 trillion. Morgan Stanley, total assets less than $1 trillion. Total exposure to derivatives, more than $31 trillion. Overall, the biggest U.S. banks collectively have more than $247 trillion of exposure to derivatives contracts. This is an amount of money that is more than 13 times the size of the U.S. national debt. And it's a ticking time bomb that could set off financial Armageddon at any moment. This is gambling on the future of the world economy on an unprecedented scale. And just like every other bubble before it, the too-big-to-fail derivatives bubble will burst. The bubble to end all bubbles. Because of its sheer size, it's inflated to a size far greater than the dot-com bubble and the mortgage CDO bubble combined. This is the final piece of the puzzle. The Fed interest rate hike, the experts claiming everything is okay, the real economy slowing down, and the bubble that is inflated to an unsustainable size. If history repeats itself, 2016 will be the year big banks come crashing down, and the Fed and our government are totally powerless to stop them. Their safety net is made out of straws. It took extraordinary efforts to prop up the big banks in 2008. During Obama's presidency, the U.S. debt doubled, reaching almost $19 trillion. Yet the economy grew at a modest pace of 2% per year. Compare that to the doubling of the derivatives market, and you begin to realize the level of economic pain we are about to feel. This will make the Great Depression of the 30s and the Great Recession of 2008 feel like a picnic. So, what would a crash look like? You need only to picture what happened in Greece to get an idea. The first thing that happened is that all the banks closed. The only way people could get their money out was with ATM withdrawals. And they were limited to 60 euros a day. That's about $63. Ask yourself this: if the banks close in the U.S., could you live with $63 per day? Immediately, huge lines formed in front of ATMs. People waited in the scorching heat for hours to get a tiny fraction of their savings and deposits out. 17% of the Greek population is currently unable to meet their daily needs for food. Approximately 30% are living below the poverty line. The official unemployment rate is 27%, 52% of under 25s. In Athens, Greece's capital, one of these is 53-year-old Athenian Vasilis Dimopoulos, who used to earn up to 3,000 euros per month until his employer folded in 2008. I sold my home in 2007, though the small profit I made is now gone. I was on the streets for 6 months, he said. Now, Dimopoulos lives in a Red Cross hostel selling Athens street paper, Shadia. Dionysia Michalidou, retiree. I have no insurance. I have no pension. I have nothing. Since the crisis, suicides have increased by roughly 50%. Emmy Christoulis, daughter of suicide victim. If one Greek was to take up a Kalashnikov, I would be the second. I find no other solution than that of a dignified exit before I begin searching through the garbage for my food. I believe that one day, because the younger generation has no future, they will take up arms and hang the traitors of the nation. Keep in mind that Greece received bailouts in 2015, and yet this is the situation there. Who will be able to bail out the world's largest economy? No one. The crisis brought by the collapse of the too-big-to-fail banks will be global, and it will dwarf anything the world has ever seen. Personally, I expect that everything that happened in Greece will happen in the U.S., but on a much greater scale, and the impacts will be far worse. I have studied economics for the past 35 years. I have seen it go through good times, and I have studied the bad ones. I went through the numbers over and over again, thinking this is not real, thinking I had made a mistake somewhere. But many other economic experts say the same thing. The same experts who warned us about the crisis coming in 2008 are all sounding the alarm bells. Peter Schiff, Gerald Celente, Mark Faber, and many others are predicting a disaster.
Where'd you get your bonds?
The Federal Reserve has cut its key interest rate to the lowest level on record. The federal funds rate, the interest that banks charge.
Crisis will happen. The biggest fiscal stimulus we have ever seen.
And that'll solve the problem. We're in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action. We boosted confidence in money market.
Have you taken a large home loan? Or did you put your savings in stocks, mutual funds, or bonds? If not, then you can relax. But all of us who did are living on borrowed time. This is the story of the greatest financial crisis of our time, the one that is on its way.
They spent hundreds of billions of dollars to show that they were doing something, but not properly designed and not as effective as it should have been.
When they start losing money, hey, we got to get back in the game. We got to get those dice rolling again. Hey, let's create another bubble. You think the dot-com bubble was too big? We got a bigger one for you. We'll call it the real estate and the credit.
Well, the problem is they never actually cure the crisis, right? They just give alcohol to a drunk. It doesn't sober him up. It just, sets him up for, a bigger hangover. And that's all we've done. And that's all we're trying to do. And so I know at some point you kill the patient, right? At some point you can't drink anymore. It's just the end of it. You reach the end of the ability. And that's where we are.
Congress wanted to believe them. Congress wanted an excuse to bail out the auto workers. And the executives gave them just enough political cover to say, well, I'm not really doing this because I want auto worker votes and I'm going to give them a huge amount of money. I'm really doing this for the American economy.
So the solution is the problem. That's why we had a problem in the first place. And this is the danger in protecting investors and consumers from the consequences of their own decisions.
We can do it, but we need to do it soon because the clock is ticking and time is not working in our favor.
I know many Americans have questions tonight. How did we reach this point in our economy? And what does this mean for your financial future? These are good questions, and they deserve clear answers. And they deserve clear answers. First, how did our economy...
They took down the symbols, the financial symbols of America, the twin towers of the world trade.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center.
My old company, my old company where I used to work, the whole company's missing.
The story of the great financial crisis begins, just like many of the stories of our era, in the United States on September 11th, 2001. The terrorists knew exactly what they were doing, striking at the ultimate symbol of the global economy. And they did it when the US was already slumping into a recession after the dot-com bubble had burst.
Despite the tragic events of September the 11th, the foundations of our free society remain sound, and I am confident that we will recover and prosper as we have in the past.
In spring 2001, the Federal Reserve started lowering interest rates. And now it continued lowering rates to save companies on the brink and to keep unemployment down. During 2001, the interest rate was lowered from 6.5 to 1.75%. In 2003, it was cut all the way to 1%, and it remained there for a full year.
Predicting the panic of 2008, the economic 9/11, and the current economic crisis that we're still in was probably one of the easiest forecasts we've ever made in our 30 years of trend forecasting. It was very simple.
Gerald Celente lives in Kingston, a few miles north of New York. He's one of the top trend analysts in the US. He has been called a modern Nostradamus. He didn't just predict the current crisis, he also predicted the dot-com bubble and the stock market collapse of 1987.
Immediately after 9/11, the President of the United States, George W. Bush, told the people to be good Americans and go out and shop. But how are they going to do it? You're in a recession. The Federal Reserve comes to the rescue.
In his memoir, Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan writes that he knew that low interest rates might cause a bubble.
It's party time!
Traditionally, central banks remove the punch bowl once the party starts. The interest rate can't remain low for too long, or people will do things they'll regret later.
This is one party that just has to turn out right.
Well, the purpose of a party is to have fun together. And a successful party needs planning and skill.
Greenspan argued that the Fed should never remove the punch bowl, but rather keep refilling it when the party started to peter out. And if things went bad, the Fed would clean up the mess and tend to the hangover. Banks and speculators loved it. Now they could take greater risks than ever before. If they were successful, they could keep the profits. And if they were unlucky, Greenspan would rescue them.
Mom was that way. Let me come home crying over something and she'd give me candy every time.
When you see the stock market come down and the real estate bubble burst, all that phony wealth is going to evaporate. And all that's going to be left is all the debt that we accumulated to foreigners.
Peter Schiff is another analyst who was roundly mocked when he predicted a crisis for the US economy in the midst of the boom.
We went on an unprecedented global spending binge. American citizens borrowed and spent trillions of dollars to buy stuff. And that is why we're in so much trouble. It was because we got drunk on all that Fed alcohol. Fed alcohol. Fed alcohol.
In a world that was suddenly uncertain, with the country under attack, nothing felt safer than investing in your own home, in the American dream.
I do believe in the American dream. I believe there is such a thing as the American dream. Owning a home is a part of that dream. It just is. Right here in America, if you own your own home, you're realizing the American dream.
Vernon Smith was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. He received it for his research in experimental economics. In his experiments, he puts economic theories to the test. Smith is an expert on bubbles.
If you can buy a home with almost nothing down, then you do well if the prices continue to go up. If it goes down, well, then you have an incentive to walk away from it and let the bank have it.
Low interest rates caused a housing bubble. Cheap loans encouraged people to buy more and bigger homes. Housing prices began to rise by 10% a year. So many took out a second mortgage on their old house to fund consumption.
You want to go on that vacation? Buy some new clothes? How about putting an addition on your house? You don't have the money? How about a home equity loan? That's for you. Let's use your house as a piggy bank.
The banks granted loans to almost anyone. Why would you need a decent income to buy a home if you can get rich just living in it? The market even coined the term Nina loans. No income, no assets, no problem. You'll get a loan anyway.
The legislation was more aggressively pushing lenders to lend to people of modest means, people whose incomes were 80% of the median income or below.
Politicians encouraged this. For a long time, both the left and the right have been encouraging home ownership. So they've created deductions, subsidies, and insurances. And they created two huge mortgage financing companies, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Their job was to use thousands of billions of dollars to insure loans for people who couldn't get them on the open market. They were government-sponsored enterprises. They had private owners, but they had been created by Congress, and their transactions were guaranteed by the government.
So particularly Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are government-sponsored enterprises. And what it means is they're private, not now maybe, but they're private companies that have special charters from the government. And the thing about government-sponsored enterprises, which is the main thing people are talking about, is a sense that they're guaranteed by the government.
First of all, government-sponsored corporations that help create our mortgage system. I introduced two of the leaders here today. They call those people Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as well as the federal home loan banks, will increase their commitment to minority markets by more than $440 billion.
In the last decade, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have donated more than $200 million to politicians in Washington. Enterprise-sponsored government. I asked the former Freddie Mac chief economist what they got for their money.
I don't know. I mean, that's a tougher question. No, they had a pretty good charter. They were regulated in a spotty way. In many ways, the regulatory structure wasn't that bad, but it was the case that the regulatory structure was a compromise. It wasn't a treasury, it wasn't a housing, really. It was somewhere in between.
You know, there was a huge moral hazard courtesy of the government in the mortgage market. When the government, through Fannie and Freddie, started to guarantee mortgages, then the lenders were no longer worried about getting their money back because the government said, we guarantee it.
And so that's why I've proposed and urged Congress to fully fund the American Dream Down Payment Fund. This will use money, taxpayers' money, to help a qualified low-income buyer make a down payment.
Well, greed has to be balanced with a certain amount of fear, and that's what down payment rules are all about, and amortization rules, is to keep people from carried away by, as you say, the greed of expecting to become rich by buying a home and reselling it at a higher price.
And that's important. If one of the barriers to home ownership is the inability to make a down payment, and if one of the goals is to increase home ownership, it makes sense to help people pay that down payment.
This is the problem, the moral hazard. We gave a moral hazard to home buyers. Once you say that you can buy a home with no down payment, all of a sudden there's no risk to the borrower. He doesn't care if he overpays, because if the house keeps going up, he makes money. If it stops going up, the bank loses the money. We have moral hazards in our banking system. The U.S. government guarantees all bank deposits. Well, what does that mean? That means that depositors don't care what the banks do with their money once they deposit it because they know the government guarantees it.
And the federal government obviously has to play an important role. And we will. We will. I mean, when I lay out a goal, I mean it.
Why are they doing that? Why can't we let mortgages be financed in the private sector? The reason is because the private sector would not finance these crazy mortgages, and real estate prices would have to come down to levels that people can actually afford.
How can you promote home ownership if people can't afford the home?
The big banks dared to make riskier loans because they had started repackaging loans and selling them to others as securities. They sold them to each other, to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and they sold them to Norway, to Germany, and to China. If the loans turned bad, someone else would end up with a hot potato.
I guess we're a little early. What do you want to do?
Anything but inspect this temple of capitalism.
Oh, Nick.
Look at them. Their eyes popping out of their heads, drooling over the very things that are taking away their jobs.
Now, Nick, don't get all excited. My family think that America is a pretty swell place, and I don't want you to disillusion them.
I know.
Everybody wanted to buy because the rating agencies that rate securities gave the mortgage-backed bonds their highest rating. They promised huge payoffs at near zero risk. The rating agencies thought that house prices would just keep rising. And then there was that minor detail that the rating agencies were being paid by the sellers of the securities.
And I think the process was corrupted. First of all, the government licenses Moody's and Standard & Poor's. So there's only a few companies who are authorized to rate these bonds. So it wasn't really a free market. The government was in bed with Moody's and with Standard & Poor's. But also you had this perverse relationship between Wall Street and the rating agencies where they were paying the rating agencies to rate the products that they were structuring. And so there was, this was an incestuous relationship where they knew if they put bad ratings on them, they wouldn't sell. And if they didn't sell, they wouldn't be making all this money constantly rating them.
They were great days, but it was all based on a market on steroids. Loans were cheap enough to keep driving housing prices up. But when interest rates returned to normal levels in 2006, the spell was broken. But for one person, the future was still bright. Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan's successor as Federal Reserve Chairman.
Tell me, what is the worst case scenario if, in fact, we were to see prices come down substantially across the country?
Well, I guess I don't buy your premise. It's a pretty unlikely possibility. We've never had a decline in house prices on a nationwide basis.
People could no longer get new loans to pay off the old ones. Those who had been given a mortgage despite a very low income couldn't afford to stay. The prices started falling, making the mortgage-backed securities increasingly worthless.
There's not much indication at this point that subprime mortgage issues have spread into the broader mortgage market, which still seems to be healthy.
The rating agencies removed the high ratings from the securities. Investors who never looked beyond the ratings suddenly didn't know what they had bought. They didn't know how risky those loans were.
Overall, the U.S. economy appears likely to expand at a moderate pace over the second half of 2007, with growth then strengthening a bit in 2008 to a rate close to the economy's underlying trend.
The dominoes started falling. Investors stopped buying mortgage-backed securities and refused to lend to those who depended on them. Investment banks like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers suddenly couldn't get new loans to stay in business. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac could no longer hide the disaster. The financial crisis started in a way that is eerily similar to today's situation. It started with an economic crisis in the US and a government that responded decisively. After 9/11 and the dot-com collapse, the US government decided to save the economy by inflating a new bubble. Today, the world is trying to get out of the financial crisis by inflating a new bubble. The difference is that this bubble is much bigger.
After they did the dot-com bubble, and that burst, and they reinflated it with the real estate and credit crisis bubble, and then when that burst, now they've created the bubble of all bubbles. And it's not only the United States, this is a global bubble. They're all into it. It's called the bailout bubble. Hey, the economy's going down, recession's setting in, sales don't look good, exports soft, need more money? How about we'll call it stimulus packages? And from Australia to the United States, from the UK to China, they're dumping funny money into the system to keep it going.
In September of 2008, the US economy is near collapse. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been taken over by the government. On September 15th, giant investment bank Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt after monumental bets on real estate. AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, collapses the next day. Fear sets in. It seems like anyone can fail. Suddenly, banks no longer dare make loans to companies or each other. Experts warn that the economy is about to collapse.
This CBS News special report, a presidential address to the nation. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Katie Couric.
Good evening, everyone. President Bush asked the networks for this television time so he could talk directly to you about a national crisis. Some of this country's major financial institutions are in danger of collapsing under the weight of bad mortgages, and that would be devastating for the entire economy.
We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action.
In a televised speech, Bush scares the market even more, while still claiming that they can trust him. He has a solution.
Under our proposal, the federal government would put up to $700 billion taxpayer dollars on the line to purchase troubled assets that are clogging the financial system.
The US government wants to spend huge amount on Wall Street banks to cover their bad deals. Even banks who don't want the money will be forced to take it, so that the public won't know which banks are on the brink of collapse.
All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The ayes have it.
I want to thank the Secretary of the Treasury for working hard with the members. I thank the members for working long hours like they've been doing to come up with a solution that's bipartisan and that'll solve the problem.
On October 3rd, Congress approves the biggest financial bailout in history. $700 billion. Around the world, in Germany, Italy, Canada, South Korea and Great Britain, other politicians do the same to save their banks.
We've taken the right, the decisive and the tough decision that was necessary to protect the stability of the financial system and to protect the depositors.
David Walker was US Comptroller General from 1998 to 2008. He quit because he was so worried about the US economy that he wanted to have the freedom to warn about what may happen.
In my view, the bailout was necessary in certain regards, but in many cases we wasted a lot of money because we didn't do three things. First, have clearly defined objectives about what we were trying to achieve. Secondly, have criteria established up front as to who would get the money and who wouldn't get the money. And number three, have conditions established up front as to what they could and couldn't do with the money. And as a result of not having those three things, some people got the money that didn't deserve it. Other people got the money that didn't make good use of it. And as a result, we had a lot of waste with regard to taxpayer money.
What would it mean if the domestic industry were allowed to fail? You heard Senator Stabenow, so I won't repeat other than to say...
As a result of the crisis, the situation for the US auto industry became critical. On November 19th, their CEOs fly to Washington to demand money.
The executives came out and they said, if you don't do this, we are going to see a jobs holocaust. They issued extremely high estimates of how many jobs would be lost that included counting every single company that supplies them with anything.
That's why this is all about a lot more than just Detroit. It's about saving the U.S. economy from a catastrophic collapse.
A month later, President Bush gives billions of dollars to General Motors and Chrysler. The money comes from the bailout package that was really only designed to save the financial industry.
Now some U.S. auto executives say that their companies are nearing collapse, and that the only way they can buy time to restructure is with help from the federal government.
Megan McArdle is a financial analyst for The Atlantic and has written extensively about the problems of the U.S. auto industry.
Congress wanted an excuse to bail out the auto workers, and the executives gave them just enough political cover to say, well, I'm not really doing this because I want auto worker votes and I'm going to give them a huge amount of money. I'm really doing this for the American economy. But if you look at how much money we gave them, I mean, you're talking about almost $100 billion is how much we will end up spending on this. You know, even if you were saving millions of jobs, it would have been cheaper to give every single one of those people $100,000 to go out and, find a new job.
The big guys on Wall Street, they can't take their losses. They're crybaby capitalists. Oh, they preach capitalism for everybody but themselves.
The Federal Reserve has cut its key interest rate to the lowest level on record. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke and his colleagues also pledged to use all available tools to contain the widening crisis and the longest recession in a quarter century.
December 16th, 2008. It is time again to pour alcohol into the punch bowl. The Federal Reserve reduces interest rates to practically zero to restore investor confidence. Other central banks do the same.
Hey, have no credit? Don't worry about it. Just sign on a dotted line.
The housing bubble that they inflated blew up with all the carnage and all the bankruptcies. And now what is their solution? Well, gee, let's do the same thing we did before. Instead of having interest rates at 1%, let's have them at 0. And let's buy everything we can. Let's print money and buy mortgages. Let's buy credit card debt, student loans. Let's buy bonds and let's drop money from helicopters to try to get the same risk-taking, excessive gambling on Wall Street. Let's try to convince Americans who are already loaded up on debt to go out and buy more stuff, to go out and go deeper into debt. And if the banks don't want to lend them money, let's make them lend them money. I mean, this is economic, suicide.
While the Fed lowers interest rates, President-elect Barack Obama prepares an enormous stimulus package meant to get the U.S. economy going.
We are running out of the traditional ammunition that's used in a recession, which is to lower interest rates. They're getting to be about as low as they can go.
The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that I will sign today, a plan that meets the principles I laid out in January, is the most sweeping economic recovery package in our history.
On February 7th, 2009, Obama approves a stimulus package worth $787 billion. With the Bush stimulus package from the year before, U.S. politicians have now spent close to $1 trillion to stimulate the U.S. economy. The money is spent on roads, airports, education, unemployment, and other benefits.
There's a bureaucracy in everywhere. And, in Italy, they used to say where I'm from, when you have a jar of honey, you lick your fingers.
The town of Union is located a few hours from the Canadian border. This is where the computer company IBM got its start and grew to be the biggest in the world. The factories are now empty, but the town has acquired a small town rhythm. So there was surprise when $600,000 from the stimulus package arrived to combat homelessness.
On occasion, our police officers may run across someone and they try to, take the person to an area where the individual can get some shelter and get something to eat. But it's not a problem here.
This is Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, probably the world's most famous upscale shopping district. It was here, for example, that Julia Roberts went shopping in Pretty Woman. Stimulus money has made its way here as well. These streets are to be repaved to the tune of $1 million. Sure, there are potholes in the asphalt. But is this really the economy that needs to be stimulated?
We had a $787 billion stimulus bill, but only about 1/3 of it was truly stimulus. By that I mean timely, targeted, and temporary. The other 2/3 were things that people wanted to do, had been wanting to do for a long time, but they didn't want to have to pay for it. They wanted to do it as part of emergency legislation and charge it to the national credit card.
The Johnstown, Pennsylvania airport has 3 scheduled flights a day. Other than that, it's quite empty.
When you have the flights coming, that's when the people are here.
Right.
Other than that, it's empty.
But one face is everywhere. Congressman John Murtha, the airport's namesake. He's been called the King of Pork and has gotten $200 million for Murtha Airport from Washington. Earlier this year, the airport got a new source of revenue, $800,000 from the stimulus package to repave this backup landing strip. The head of the airport insists that the landing strip is safe. So why does it need doing if it's not a safety issue?
Because of the steps we've taken, this plant is about to shift into high gear.
One of the biggest stimulus programs was aimed at the auto industry, Cash for Clunkers. Turn in your old car and get cash toward a new one from the government. It was so popular that its $1 billion budget ran out in a week, so more money was quickly injected. Many countries offered similar programs. Germany had the biggest one and handed out almost $7 billion to those who scrapped any car more than 9 years old while buying a new one.
Our government seemed to think that German auto industry is so important, we have to support it in some ways, and therefore they created this bonus. They didn't call it a scrapping bonus because I think they knew just how ridiculous that was, so they called it an environment bonus.
Karen Horn is a doctor of economics at the German Economics Institute.
And of course, people took advantage of that. It worked. As long as it was on, the program worked, but now it's out, it's over, and of course numbers are dropping. People are feeling that they ran into additional debt due to that bonus that they wanted to take advantage of, and they're having problems they didn't anticipate.
So Germany spent almost $7 billion to scrap fully functioning cars and to maintain excessive auto factory output. Once the program ended, the industry was right back in the doldrums.
I was just very surprised that people would accept the idea so readily. That they would accept the money is something else, who wouldn't, but that they would find this a solution that they deemed viable. It doesn't give me a very good impression of the rationality of the voter and taxpayer, I must say.
And that's where we are. I think at this point, the problem is now so big that government stimulus is not going to, buy us another 5 or 6 years of phony growth like it did last time. Because we have to accumulate so much more debt now. Because the bigger the problem gets, the more we have to stimulate to get that short-term boost. But now the bigger the bust, because now we have a bigger stimulus, to get out of the economy.
About a year after the worst economic crisis in modern history, Lehman Brothers is gone. But apart from that, Wall Street looks much the same. Many banks are reporting record profits. The world's stock markets have skyrocketed. The market is finally breathing a sigh of relief. But isn't it somewhat uncomfortable? Haven't we been here before? All the measures that we have taken to save the economy, the low interest rates, the massive debt, the safety net for the financial industry, these are the very things that led us into a crisis in the first place. We've been saved from the consequences of one burst bubble by inflating 100 new ones all over the world.
One year ago, I took office amid 2 wars, an economy rocked by a severe recession, a financial system on the verge of collapse, and a government deeply in debt. Experts from across the political spectrum warned that if we did not act, we might face a second depression. So we acted, immediately and aggressively. And 1 year later, the worst of the storm has passed.
Viens avec moi à l'hôtel d'amour. L'amour est partout. L'amour est pur et libre. Réaliser tes rêves à l'hôtel d'amour.
There are positive signs. This is the Hamptons outside New York, a classic playground for Manhattan's elite. A house by the Atlantic like this one costs $30 million. And a hot dog bun with lobster salad costs $18. Fast food, Hampton style. The crisis has made its mark here too. There are fewer private jets at the airport. Instead, the Porsches jostle the Mercedes on the turnpike to New York.
New York City, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, California don't represent the real world. They also don't represent the real part of America, the so-called Main Street of America.
My tax money go to Beverly Hills. Well, there's a lot of money in Beverly Hills. I don't think they needed my money down there. But that's a different world. That's not a reality, you know, than that.
If you ever visit Union and need a haircut, you may well end up at Frank Petrilli's barbershop.
But unfortunately, a lot of people lost their homes because they lost their jobs. And they're now living the life that one time were able to do it. A lot of the young people, especially educated, they try to move, go out of town. But I believe no matter where they go, the situation is the same all over. Where are they going to go? Detroit?
Now listen, son. I wasn't going to tell you this, but you're the reason we came here all the way from Indiana. You've heard all the talkers. Now I'm going to show you the doers.
The US government has launched bailouts, stimulus packages and guarantees to the tune of $10,000 billion.
Caught myself wondering for the 100th time how the hell I got here. What the hell I'm doing here.
That's more than the total cost to the US government for World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the invasion of Iraq, the New Deal, the Marshall Plan, and the moon landing. Bush almost racked up more US debt than all presidents before him combined, from George Washington to Bill Clinton. And Obama is almost creating greater debt than all presidents before him, including George W. Bush. But it's not just the US that's increasingly looking like a house of cards. During the crisis, many governments went deeply into debt. Estimates say that the average debt in the richest nations will exceed 100% by the year 2011. These are loans taken at currently low interest rates. Should the interest rate rise by 1%, the US interest payments will rise by $100 billion per year. That's more than the annual cost for the Vietnam War.
Sometimes it's just an engine failure, other times it's the deadly flak. If the pilot's lucky, the flak kills him. But usually he isn't, and he burns to death as his plane spins in.
It sounds absurd to even think that the United States, the world's economic superpower, might crash. After all, they get the highest ratings from the credit rating agencies.
One of the lessons that we must learn from the mortgage-related subprime is you have to take credit ratings with a big grain of salt. Because as we saw with the mortgage-related securities, they went from AAA rating to junk bond pretty fast once people understood the true situation. Today, the United States is rated AAA, but if it doesn't start taking steps to put its financial house in order, that AAA rating will be lost. It's only a matter of when and how quickly.
In September 2008, the bankruptcy of one large investment bank brought the world economy to its knees. The fate of Lehman Brothers raised the question of who was next in line, so everyone avoided doing business with banks. How will the world react if the next entity to declare bankruptcy is a nation? Who is next in line if that were to happen? Some houses of cards have already started falling. This is Iceland, until recently one of the richest nations in the world. When the crisis hit, the Icelandic banks collapsed. The Icelandic stock market crashed, leaving the debt with a small population. For the first time in 50 years, this peaceful country saw riots. This is Greece. Here, deficits have hit a record high. The national debt is approaching 135% of GDP. The market wants higher interest rates for Greek loans, increasing the pressure on its strained economy. It seems like the Greek government needs a bailout to avoid collapse. Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Great Britain are other EU nations with similar problems. What about my country, Sweden? The country's finances are fairly robust. Our national debt and deficit are lower than that of most nations. But Sweden is highly dependent on the world economy. More than half of our prosperity is based on exports. When other countries crash, we get hit almost as hard. And Swedish housing prices have risen during the crisis, despite the recession and despite rising unemployment. But because of low interest rates and a government mortgage company, SBAB, making loans easier to get. Swedes have never carried more debt in relation to their income. Doesn't all of this sound very familiar?
We have new bubbles everywhere, so I am pretty worried about what's going to happen.
If you don't want bubbles to burst, then don't blow them up in the first place, because all bubbles burst.
If enough things can go wrong, some of them probably will. The question is just which needle will burst this bubble? Will it be new credit losses as banks take on greater risks, knowing that the government considers them too big to fail? Or falling stock prices as interest rates rise and the steroids wear off? Will it be the Chinese economy overheating? Or will it be a collapse of confidence in the US dollar?
If we lose the confidence of our foreign lenders, and we must not allow that to happen, but if that were to happen, then there would be a dramatic decline in the dollar, a dramatic increase in interest rates, significant fueling of inflation, a very, very deep recession and possibly depression that would be felt around the world. We must not allow that to happen.
When the next bubble bursts, you cannot use the same emergency measures. You can't lower interest rates that are already at rock bottom. You can't stimulate the economy with borrowed money if an excessive national debt is the cause of the crisis. The governments could save the banks, But who can save the governments?
Ultimately, there's going to be a price all around the world to be paid for this. And the longer it continues, the bigger that price is going to be.
You know, this really is a moral question. I mean, I can give you plenty of big and bad numbers. You know, when you talk about tens of trillions of dollars, it's just hard to imagine. But you have to put a face on it. And to me, I put my children's and my grandchildren's face on it. It's their future that we're mortgaging.
When we tell people that there's going to be a bailout bubble, and they see the world equity markets up 50, 60%, they don't want to believe that it's another bubble. They want to step right up back to that table and throw their dice and try to win their hand at the wheel of fortune that Wall Street's spinning. So people still don't want to believe that the worst is yet to come.
It's easy to think of these predictions as much too gloomy, but that is exactly what people said the last time. When these experts predicted the 2008 financial crisis, they were laughed at in the media.
You guys are deluding yourselves.
We can do it, but we need to do it soon because the clock is ticking and time is not working in our favor.